story. Now, before I get to the stories, though, of the men that were buried here that fought in this war, including one of my own ancestors, allow me to do an overview of the war itself so that we can just refresh our memories, and then we'll place our vets in the proper context of where they fit within that story. So, the Spanish-American War, just a short little war. The fighting itself only lasted for 4 months, from April to August of 1898. It was fought in 2 theaters, the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. It ended officially with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898, although the fighting itself had ended several months prior, on August 12th, with the signing of an armistice agreement between the United States and Spain. Now, the Treaty of Paris gave the United States possession of Guam and Puerto Rico. It allowed the United States to be able to purchase the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. And it also made Cuba a protectorate of the United States, although the U.S. would grant independence to Cuba in 1902. Although it did maintain a lease agreement with that newly formed Cuban government that would allow the United States to maintain a naval base right there on Guantanamo Bay, which is still in operation today. Now, the short little war, the Spanish-American War, was just a tiny little piece of a larger conflict that had been going on for a while between Spain and Cuba. Cuba having been under Spanish rule for 400 years. The main issue with their conflict had to do with Cuban independence. Cuba wanted to be independent of Spain. Now, the Cuban War for Independence began officially in 1893. It ended in 1898 with the end of the Spanish-American War. Now, you can bet the United States was paying close attention to what was developing over there within that conflict between Spain and Cuba, because Cuba was a main source of sugar and tobacco for the United States. And this whole conflict between Spain and Cuba, it was just making it difficult for American business interests there in Cuba. And so there was a ton of pressure being put on President McKinley and on Congress to intervene, to mediate, to do something to end this war. Now, around the same time, you had your newspaper giants, you know these guys, William Pulitzer Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst. They began publishing sensationalized reports that were sensationalized reports that were just showing how the Cubans were being mistreated and oppressed by Spain, which of course was just whipping up sympathy among the American public to jump into the war and do something to help the Cubans win their freedom. Now, McKinley was wary of entering the war. He actually did his best to try and keep America out of it. However, this was not to be. So he had sent a U.S. warship, the USS Maine, to Havana, Cuba, to be stationed there in the harbor. And the mission for that ship was to protect American citizens and American business interests there in Cuba. But on February 15, 1898, the USS Maine just unexpectedly exploded in the middle of the harbor, sinking and taking 266 U.S. servicemen down with it. Now, several investigations were done and that brought conflicting reports. Some of those reports said it came from an external source. Others said it came from internal, from within the ship, such as a malfunctioning boiler exploding. We may never know the true answer, but it didn't matter. Spain was believed to be the cause in the minds of most Americans, and so the cry, "Remember the Maine," rang out throughout the whole country. Now, the United States officially declared war on Spain on April 25th, 1898. Volunteers just poured in. The first amount of volunteers, they totaled 220,000, which was 4 times the amount that they were trying to get. So, as I said, this war was fought in 2 theaters, right? The Pacific Ocean, that was in the Philippines and Guam, but also the Caribbean theater, which is Cuba and Puerto Rico. And I am going to focus on the Caribbean theater because that's where all the vets that are buried here from this war, where they were sent. But just know that at the same time as everything that I'm about to share with you that was unfolding in the Caribbean theater, there was a whole other aspect of the war happening over in the Pacific Ocean. But I can tell you how the story ended. We all know that America won, so that's how that ended. But I'm going to turn our attention to the Caribbean theater and tell you the developments of what unfolded there, which I think is kind of a fascinating story, actually. So the war for Cuba, the battle for Cuba, the main U.S. objectives there were threefold: to defeat the Spanish army on land, to capture the port city of Santiago de Cuba, and also to defeat the Spanish Caribbean Squadron, which was the name of the Spanish Navy stationed there. So the United States Navy, they were focusing their operations on securing Guantanamo Bay and also capturing the port city of Santiago de Cuba. Now, if you aren't familiar with Cuban geography, that's okay. Just know that those two places are nearby. And in between the two is something called the San Juan Hills, which you may have heard of, which does figure into the story. Now, on May 25th, the United States Navy had managed to create a naval blockade, essentially trapping the entire Spanish Caribbean Squadron in the Santiago Harbor, which this standoff between the two naval fleets, that would continue for 5 weeks. So 2 weeks after this blockade began, the U.S. Navy also invaded Guantanamo Bay and began landing American troops there. Now, the whole goal for the capture of the city of Santiago de Cuba was that the U.S. troops that were landing there would continue by land, and then the Navy would continue by sea. So in order for the U.S. troops that had landed at Guantanamo Bay to reach the city by land, they had to break through enemy lines that were encamped all in the San Juan Hills. So on July 1st, 15,000 American troops with some Cuban forces managed to defeat the entire Spanish army. Now, this was done with the help of something that we know we call the Rough Riders, right? Teddy Roosevelt had resigned from his position as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in order to form that now famous cavalry, the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were very instrumental in the American victories there in the San Juan Hills, in the battles of El Caney and the Battle of San Juan Hill. Now, 2 days later, this is July 3rd, the Americans and the Cubans finally make it to the harbor right at the border of the city there, and they began to lay siege of the city of Santiago de Cuba. Now, the Spanish Caribbean Squadron, you remember where those guys are? They're in the harbor, right? So they decide on July 3rd, that same day, that they're going to make a break for it, a run for it, and try and break through the U.S. naval blockade, because they had seen the U.S. troops and the Cuban forces arrived there on the border of the harbor, and well, they just didn't feel very safe to stay there, right? So they figured they had a better chance at a battle at open sea than just to remain basically sitting ducks trapped in the harbor. So they decide they're going to try and break through. Well, the name of that battle was the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, and it ended with the U.S. Navy soundly defeating the Spanish Caribbean Squadron, essentially sinking the entire fleet, all of them, as they tried to bust through the harbor and make for open sea. So this was a decisive event in the American victory of the Spanish-American War. So now that siege that had just begun, that siege of the city, that would continue for 13 days, with the Spanish forces finally surrendering the city to the Americans. Now, this was pretty much the end of the major fighting going on in Cuba. Well, if you think about it, what more can happen? The entire Spanish fleet has been sunk. The major bulk of their army, the Spanish army, has been defeated in the San Juan Hills. There isn't really much more that can happen at this point. The fighting would officially be over a few weeks later with the signing of the armistice agreement on August 12th, as I mentioned. But really, it's pretty much winding down. Not much left to happen here. So after these events happened, it was just clear that the U.S. Navy was in bad shape. They were debilitated by yellow fever and heat exhaustion by this time, and actually more troops died from those things than they did in the war itself. So Teddy Roosevelt fought to have the troops removed from Cuba, and 29,000 soldiers were removed to Camp Wyckoff, which is in Long Island, New York, where they could recover. Now, just know that while all this fighting between the Spanish and the Americans is going on in Cuba, the Americans were also fighting the Spanish in Puerto Rico. Now, the fighting there did end on August 12th with the signing of the armistice agreement, without either side having a significant victory or defeat. Now that we understand how the major events unfolded in the Caribbean theater, we can place our Spanish-American War events buried here in Fairview where they fit into this story. And I'll start with my ancestor, William John Wren. He's buried right over there. If you look, you can see a tall pole with some orange flags flying. That's where his marker is. You can see a picture of it in your program. So William John Wren enlisted in the Missouri 6th Volunteer Regiment. He was in Company G of this regiment. Now this regiment was organized after President McKinley's second call for troops. It was sent to Cuba in December of 1898 after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and its mission was to help with the occupation of Cuba, because remember that would remain a U.S. protectorate for a couple of years until it gained its independence. So they were there to assist with that process, that they would remain there in service for 3 months, at which time then they would be sent back. My ancestor, William, he was officially discharged from service on March 18, 1899, at which time he returned home to his family here in New Albany. Now also buried here is George Augustus Bicknell III. He is buried right over there, and actually when you're at the Mexican War Monument, he's right across the street, right there, you can't miss him. Now he was an admiral in the United States Navy. So during the Spanish-American War, he commanded the USS Niagara. Now Niagara was a steamer that was built by John Roach and Sons in Pennsylvania in 1877. The U.S. Navy acquired Niagara in April of 1898 for service in the Spanish-American War, and she was fitted out as a distilling and supply ship. Now a distilling ship, that was one that had special stills on board that could convert salt water to fresh water. So the USS Niagara provided fresh water and supplies for the American fleet stationed in the Caribbean. Now, after the war was done, Admiral Bicknell was eventually promoted to Rear Admiral in 1907 and would retire from service a year later. Other than these two, all the rest of the veterans from this war buried here in Fairview were all from the same regiment. So let me close with the story of their regiment. And this was the 159th Indiana Volunteer Regiment. Now the 159th Indiana Volunteer Regiment was formed from the 1st Regiment of Infantry of the Indiana National Guard. And it was comprised of companies from a number of cities all over the state of Indiana. Mustered into service in Indianapolis at Camp Mount on May 12th. A few days later, it would leave Indianapolis and eventually end up in Port Tampa, Florida, where it would begin its preparations to sail to Cuba. They were actually well on their way and not far from being complete when all of their preparations were halted due to the signing of the Armistice Agreement on August 12th, which essentially ended the fighting and ended the need for them to continue preparing. And so a couple weeks after this happened, they would return to Indianapolis and be mustered out of service on November 4th. So although the 159th Indiana Volunteer Regiment never had a chance to participate per se in the war effort itself, allow me to list their names so that we can honor their willingness to serve their country. Their heart was there and they were ready to go. I have a paper because I do not want to miss a name. Walter Curry, Ernest Hedges, Harry J. Beers, Fred M. Knapp, John Reuben Gebhardt, James Franklin McCurdy, Barry Harbison, Albert Frederick Goodweb, Charles Goodwin, Hubert Dale Graham, Joseph A. Kern, John I. McLaughlin, William Burt Mays, Vinton Spencer Nunemacher, Lester Salyards, James S. Williams, and finally, Stuart N. Lowry. So thank you so much for taking the time to come and hear about our veterans that have served in the Spanish-American War and the other stories that you're about to hear. Thank you for your support. And with that, I turn it back over to your lovely guide.
Thank you.